Today at the National Press Club, Workplace Gender Equality Agency CEO Mary Wooldridge. Ms Wooldridge will discuss how to accelerate gender equality in Australian workplaces a month after releasing company-level data on pay gaps. Mary Wooldridge, today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. Since 2020, Mary Wooldridge has been Chief Executive Officer of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and therefore our eyes and ears into what is happening in workplaces across Australia. It has been one of her missions has been the desegregation of Australian industry. Believe it or not, we have one of the most gender segregated workforces in the world. Think healthcare, social assistance, education versus mining, construction and manufacturing. She's well placed to achieve what she sets out to in terms of addressing more gender equality in the structure of our workplaces. And to achieve that, Mary has what one would call a well-rounded curriculum vitae. She's got the inside running on how to deal with politicians, having been one herself in the Victorian Parliament between 2006 and 2020, I believe. She's worked in not-for-profits, global consultancies and media. She knows firsthand the bitter taste of finding out a bloke who's the same age and same level of experience is earning more money than her for doing the same job. She has said, I think it'd be hard to find a woman in any workplace who didn't have a personal experience of gender discrimination. And that is precisely why we're here today. So sometime in the not too distant future, it won't be the same for our daughters and their daughters. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on X, where our handle is @PressClubAust, or you can use the hashtag NPC. Please welcome Mary Wooldridge.
Thanks very much, Julie. Thanks very much to the Press Club and to the sponsors. It's really wonderful to be here today, and I'd like to take the opportunity at the outset to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people, to their elders past and present. They've loved and nurtured the land we meet on today for thousands of generations. It's wonderful also that so many champions of gender equality are here today, and at the high risk of missing people, I do want to take the opportunity to specifically acknowledge a few of them. Firstly, it's wonderful to have the support from MPs Bridget Archer and Elizabeth Lee. I want to acknowledge Padma Raman, the head of the Office for Women, and many of her team, and also former heads of the Office for Women, Chantelle Stratford and Catherine Hawkins. Kate Jenkins, the former Sex Discrimination Commissioner, who is no stranger to this podium and podiums right across the country, and Nikki Vincent, the Victorian Commissioner for Gender Equality in the Public Sector. And a wonderful characteristic of people working in gender equality is the collaborative and supportive way that we work together, each understanding that we have a vital and separate role to play, but also seeking to enhance and amplify the messages and the work that we do. I also want to acknowledge the fantastic Workplace Gender Equality Agency team, a number of whom are here today or watching on the screen. They're impressive, smart and dedicated people. And personally, it's wonderful to have the support, as I always do, of my husband, Andrew Barling, and my brother, Michael Wooldridge. The purpose of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, or as we call it, WGEA, is to promote and improve gender equality in workplaces. In simple terms, we collect and share data and specialist knowledge about the workplace and advocate and advise on ways that it can improve. Our work is accelerating much needed change, and that's for the benefit of workers, employers and the economy as a whole. Let me put that in a really tangible way. I recently received a message from Nicola, a part-time employee, mother of 3 and leader in the workplace. She reached out to thank WGEA for the advocacy on more leadership roles in part-time positions. She described the pushback that she had experienced from recruiters, from employers, and even from fellow women, about working part-time, and they reiterated that she could not continue to do so in a managerial role, let alone progress in her career, if she wanted to work part-time. What she said is that our advocacy on the issue and the messages that we sent made her feel seen and heard as a professional, valued for her skills and contribution in the workplace, but also as a parent, respected and supported for her equally important and fulfilling role raising and caring for her children. I also recently heard from Tom, a young man who'd taken 6 months of employer-funded paid parental leave to care for his first child. He wrote to tell me about the benefits of that time and what it had given him, his child, and his relationship and his well-being. What he said is that he wanted me to know that challenging employers to implement and to support the uptake of gender-neutral paid parental leave is crucial for families. It's also about creating happier, healthier, and more gender-equal societies. I also recently heard from a leader in an advisory firm who reached out to tell me that even though they were disappointed with their gender pay gap results, the publication and the resources that we had provided had helped stimulate dialogue with employees about the gender pay gap and how they could work together to fix it. These are just some simple examples of the impact of our work. Now, everyone here in this room today will have or have had a job. You know that a job is more than just a payslip. What we do is part of our identity. Our job gives us economic independence, it gives us meaning, and a way to contribute to our community and our country more broadly. And in doing that work, we want it to be worthwhile. We want it to be safe, we want our skills and talents to be fully utilised, and we want to be appropriately rewarded for our efforts. Unfortunately, some of us in this room, and many beyond, will not always have experienced the workplace in that way, and that can often be attributed to our gender. This is what drives us at WGEA. We are focused on the fact that behind every gender pay gap calculation, every composition quartile, every benchmark comparison, is a person who, like every one of us, goes to work and hopes for a fair go. Today I want to talk about WGEA, our role to drive improvement in gender equality in the workplace, about how publishing employer gender pay gaps was the logical next step and where to from here. So WGEA has a rich history. First established in 1986, the agency has evolved into a reputable and evidence-driven agent for change. We collect comprehensive data on workplace gender equality covering nearly 5 million Australian workers. In 2012, the model evolved from a sole focus on equal opportunity for women to one that encompassed both equality for men and women. It also moved to a comprehensive collection of gender equality information based on 6 gender equality indicators. The gender equality indicators set out what we know to be key components that drive gender equality in the workplace. Composition of the workforce, composition of the board, equal remuneration for men and women, the consultation with employees, flexible work practices and support for parents and carers, and making sure that the addressing sexual harassment in the workplace as well. We now have 10 years of gender data by role, remuneration, as well as employer practices and policies across all the indicators. It's been called the world's most comprehensive gender equality in the workplace dataset by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And that dataset has been used to drive change in a number of ways. First and foremost, for employers. They've been using the reporting data to inform and motivate change in their own workplaces. The ability to compare performance, policies and practices to their peers has prompted action. Even before the publication of the gender pay gaps, this action has been prompted. For example, parental leave policies are quickly standardised across peer groups when a prospective talent pool can see that one employer has a more generous offering than another. Secondly, for researchers, the open dataset has underpinned examination about what really works to drive change. WGEA's research partnership with the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, for example, in 2020, established a causal relationship between high numbers of women at the most senior roles and company profitability and value. We believe this was a world first. For individuals, the Interactive Data Explorer has informed discussions, negotiations and employment decisions. We know that job applicants check our data to see what the workplace is like. Is it inclusive? Is it fair? Is it safe when considering job offers? And for government, it's the evidence base for policy development in many instances. Most recently, it's been a valuable source for the work of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force and the National Gender Equality Strategy that the Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, launched in this room earlier this month. It's also so important to acknowledge that throughout the last 10 years, many employers have simultaneously analysed, innovated, set targets and invested for change. So since 2014, we've seen important improvements in the state of gender equality in workplaces. Women are more highly represented in managerial ranks. There's been a dramatic increase in women on boards. Gender equality is now widely embedded in employer policies, recruitment, performance and remuneration. There's been a significant expansion in flexible working, especially since the pandemic and working from home. More companies are offering paid parental leave and more are offering it universally. That is, offering it without a distinction between men and women and primary and secondary carers. And all of that and other things have led to a resulting reduction in the gender pay gap of 6.9 percentage points, down to 21.7%. These are important and meaningful gains that have changed the face of Australian corporate sector. There's also, though, been a shift in understanding, culture and expectations. It's fair to say back in 2012, the Workplace Gender Equality Act had a rocky start. It passed the House of Representatives with just a 2-vote margin, and a number of key business groups said the approach was unworkable. Since then, there's been a substantial shift in the support for the approach and the valuing of the knowledge and the change that WGEA brings. Measures such as support for workplace flexibility, equality and caregiving, and access to professional opportunities for growth and progression are no longer seen to many employees as nice to have, but essential to have. But change has been frustratingly slow. That's why in 2021, the then government undertook a review of the Workplace Gender Equality Act, which resulted in 10 recommendations to improve it. They agreed to and funded the implementation of the recommendations in the 2022-23 budget. In 2022, the new government, under the Minister for Women, Katie Gallagher, committed to implement all of the recommendations and got on with the legislative reforms, to publish employer gender pay gaps, to require reporting to boards, to expand the gender equality standards, and to also broaden the coverage of the Act to include the federal public sector. In a mark of the shift of the times, there was unanimous support across the Parliament and broadly across the business community for these changes. The highest profile of the reforms was the move to publish employer gender pay gaps, at an individual employer level. So for 10 years, WGEA has been publishing the national gender pay gap, industry-level gender pay gaps, and providing employers with a confidential report that had their results. With the slow rate of change, it was clear that a catalyst was needed. So we knew from the UK experience that that publishing employer gender pay gaps is a driver of change by creating healthy competition amongst peers, equipping employees and prospective employees with important information, and informing investors. And all of that was holding UK companies to account in progressing gender equality. On the 27th of February, WGEA published the employer gender pay gaps and the workforce composition profile by pay quartile of almost 5,000 Australian employers. The key headlines were: half of employers had a gender pay gap over 9.1%. A third had a gender pay gap in the target range of plus or minus 5%, and that men were nearly twice as likely to be in the highest earning quartile, and women were 50% more likely to be in the lowest earning quartile. The response to publishing gender pay gaps is fair to say, from our perspective, it's been phenomenal. While there was widespread coverage, importantly, there was a clear sentiment shift in the way we talk about the issue of workplace gender equality. We've largely moved from a conversation about equal pay for equal work to a broader discussion around the structural and cultural inequalities that drive workforce compositional differences as well as pay. This is what the gender pay gap measures. It's the overall difference in pay across the workforce, and while equal pay for equal work is a component, it's also critically driven by the composition of the workforce in higher and lower paid roles. For the first time, that message has started to permeate. Not with everyone, of course, you wouldn't expect it to, but in the broader discourse where it counts. Those employers who tried to claim that they didn't have a gender pay gap because they paid men and women the same for the same job were promptly corrected. Those employers who acknowledged their results and the drivers of their gender pay gaps were rewarded. I think the CEO, for example, of the A2 Milk Company, with the highest gender pay gap in the ASX 200, was a good example of a leader who earned respect for his interview on ABC's 7:30. The conversation, encouragingly, did not linger on the number, but has been about how employers are coming to terms with the number and what to do about it. This is exactly what is needed, and this is exactly what was intended. Everyone, even those with smaller gender pay gaps, recognised there was more work to be done. The media, and a number of whom are in the room today, played such an essential role in that shift. One of my favourite examples was an article in the AFR where a tech company CEO claimed that their higher gender pay gap was an unfair portrayal of gender equality in his organisation, and that there simply weren't enough women in tech to recruit into those higher paying roles. The journalist published his comments, followed by a breakdown of the gender composition by quartile at his company and all of those of his peers, showing by contrast that the peer companies, all with lower gender pay gaps, had managed to find women for those senior roles. What the publication of gender pay gaps and the commentary around it showed was that there are ways to solve these barriers to workplace gender inequality if an employer is motivated and informed. Overall, the message for employers is clear. The time for action and excuses for inaction, let me say that again. The message for employers is clear. The time for inaction and excuses is over. It's worth noting that the data that we published this year is reflective of workplaces before the 2023 amendments were enacted and will be a baseline for each employer. The data for the second round of published gender pay gaps covered the period from when the legislation was passed till now, April 23 till March 24. This timing was intentional, encouraging employers to start taking action even in advance of their gender pay gaps being published. What we are seeing is companies being proactive. Action now is preferable to excuses later. WGEA performance and benchmarking reports are now required to be presented to boards. I know from our work with the Australian Institute of Company Directors that this is creating new opportunities for conversations at the highest levels of organisations, where often there haven't been those conversations at all. Over 1,000 employers submitted a voluntary employer statement, a web link to which was published alongside their gender pay gap. Employers with the highest gender pay gaps were actually more likely to develop a statement, and they have used it thoughtfully to provide context to their results, details on their plan to address the gaps, and to articulate the link between taking action on gender equality and their company values and strategies. I've had feedback from HR professionals within organisations that ideas and proposals that have not been prioritised for consideration are now being debated and approved by executive teams and boards. One example was a head of people who had been advocating for paid parental leave for a number of years to no avail until the finalisation of their employer statement when the CEO agreed to introduce the policy. Recruitment firms are already saying that prospective employees are asking questions in interviews about the company's gender pay gap. And the investor groups are having discussions about the S in ESG and how the gender pay gap results can be incorporated into this social pillar. All the indications are that now is the time for action. To continue the momentum, gender pay gap reporting will be expanded in the next round of publication. With CEO salaries included for the first time, we'll publish the gender pay gaps by average as well as median. Measuring gender pay gaps by median, as we did this year, allows us to understand the remuneration experience of a typical employee. The average gender pay gap is a good measure of the collective remuneration of the group. As the average can be skewed by really exceptionally high or low salaries, publishing these additional results will show if earnings are particularly concentrated for one gender. For example, more men in higher earning positions. We'll also publish the gender pay gaps for individual companies that report to us, instead of grouped in the way they submitted their data, which is what we did this year. We expect that will mean we'll have the results for over 7,000 companies rather than the 5,000 that we had this year. Both of these extensions to publishing will further increase transparency and be an ongoing catalyst for action. The challenge for employers is now to identify and focus on the actions to improve gender equality in their workplace and, as part of that, reduce their gender pay gap. The WGEA team has expanded to add a small number of gender equality specialists who are delivering educational resources, webinars, masterclasses and a direct advisory service. This supports employers to undertake analysis, develop their action plan and build their own internal capability. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately. Each workplace has its own drivers of inequality and therefore needs to develop and implement their own action plans. That being said, there's some common themes that we think are useful when determining the next set of actions for a workplace, for an industry or an occupation. In their employer statements and also in their responses to the media, CEOs consistently cited both workplace gender segregation, whether that be in different industries or different roles, and unequal caring responsibilities as their primary challenges to achieving gender equality. We know that to tackle these factors, employers cannot continue with business as usual. They require inspired leadership, they require new thinking, and in some cases, working collaboratively to solve broader industry-wide challenges. The strategy consulting industry is a good example of this. A recruiter in the industry was quoted as saying in the media that men dominate senior level roles because the industry doesn't and can't change for anyone. You have to serve clients on their terms. But when you have a look at the numbers for leading firms, the proportion of women in the top pay quartile ranges from 29% to 50%. Some firms have found solutions to which others seem intractable. Too many industries and workplaces can't see an alternative leadership that doesn't look like a person who works 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, is available 24/7 and on call to travel at a moment's notice. Let's call that person a man, burdened with less unpaid work and caring responsibilities than women. To get more women into leadership roles, company executives have to reimagine what it looks like to be a senior leader or manager. We know there's companies that are doing this successfully. For example, law firm Lander & Rogers have had job-sharing partners who have effectively worked together for the last 5 years to the benefit of their clients and to their colleagues. More part-time and job-sharing roles in leadership not only benefit women, it benefits everyone. With 22% of non-managers working part-time, but only 7% of managers, there's a clear message. If you want to progress to a senior level, you have to follow the full-time, always-on approach. This largely excludes from management anyone, and that could be women and men, who cannot or do not want to work full-time. Further, many industries are dominated by one gender and have a pipeline issue, particularly in line-related roles. Some employers are tackling and addressing this. For example, Kimberly-Clark have seen a marked shift in the number of women in their manufacturing roles by revisiting their hiring practices and redesigning and retooling their factories. Taking a forklift driver's licence requirement off the job description was a critical first step. Sometimes it requires an industry-wide initiative. In the male-dominated construction industry, major companies have pledged, via the Australian Constructors Association, to transform the culture of their industry to help address current workforce shortages and to position the industry for the future. To do this, collectively, they are embedding flexible work practices, attracting new talent, and have set a target for 75% of their members to achieve the WGEA Employment of Choice Citation Award. Viva Energy is proactively addressing their composition issues in frontline positions, and their CEO just last week proudly told me of a woman who was a cleaner who is successfully retrained as a refueler, a much higher paying role. Not only has this improved her family's economic situation, but it's also serving as an inspiration for her kids as they think about their careers. Actions like this can help fundamentally shift the stereotype about men's and women's roles across all jobs, not just at senior levels. And part of this is going to be workforce necessity. The 2023 Intergenerational Report projected that the demand for care workers is expected to double over the next 40 years. We cannot fulfil the demand for this currently highly female-dominated workforce if we are only recruiting from half the population. As we shift stereotypes about work, we also need to shift stereotypes about care. There's a strong push to get more men to take on more domestic and unpaid caring responsibilities. But society and employers often send a very clear message. It's risky to take that time off work. Just look at the cost to the career of your female partner, your sister or colleague. There is a strong interdependence in this area, and more men will not take parental leave until the penalties for doing so are removed from both women and men. We want all employers to have good gender-neutral paid parental leave policies that equally supports both parents to take leave. But that in itself isn't enough. Employers need to actively encourage men to take it and create a culture where it's expected and celebrated. Further, return to work from parental leave needs to recognise that for the employee, the world has changed. It requires them to be able to work differently, to work flexibly, and to make sure that they can balance and manage both their work responsibilities and their care responsibilities. Reforms like these to stereotypes, to roles and to the approach to care will make sure that we do have workplaces that are more equal. So what's next? WGEA reporting enhances an employer's knowledge of their performance and how they compare to their peers. But we know that knowledge is not enough. We need employers to move from knowing better to doing better. And to help them to do that, employers should prepare for bold changes coming to another key recommendation from the 2021 review, that there will be a new legislated requirement for larger employers with 500 or more employees to commit to and achieve targets against the gender equality indicators. As the Minister announced as part of the National Gender Equality Strategy, the government will introduce this requirement and, as with all aspects of the Workplace Gender Equality Act, compliance will be required to access federal government procurement opportunities over specified thresholds. Targets work for gender equality. They bring a focus to specific areas of improvement and require companies to monitor their data frequently, which has been shown to accelerate the reduction in gender pay gaps. We have been consulting with employers on this new requirement. Our expectation is that large employers will have to choose 3 targets from the menu of options, and they will have 3 years to achieve them. The menu is informed by evidence on what improves gender equality. It includes both numerical targets, such as reducing the gender pay gap or improving a composition in a role or a functional area, but they also include action-based targets, such as putting in place a paid parental leave program where there is none, or enhancing the suite of flexible work that's available. Because the menu is based on data and information employers already report to WGEA, their efforts can be focused on the actual achievement of these targets. Progress can be monitored through our annual census and included in WGEA reports that go to their boards. Employers will set targets based on their particular circumstances and what will make a difference in their workplaces. Targets are about accountability, internally and externally, and seeing meaningful progress over time. The timing is obviously in the hands of the government, and I'm advised the intention is to legislate later this year. I'm sometimes told that I want everyone to be the same, to do exactly the same jobs, and that every role at every level needs to be filled by an equal number of men and women. That could not be further from the truth. Gender equality is about choice. It's about how women and men have genuine choice about how, where and when they work and how they balance that with their other commitments. For too many people in today's workforce, their choices are greatly constrained. If you're being harassed or bullied at work and it's not being addressed, you really don't have a choice but to leave. If there's no part-time role at your level, a mother who needs to or wants to work part-time may only have the choice to be underutilised or languish in more junior positions. If you can't see anyone like you in jobs, let's say male nurses or men who are early childhood educators, women on the tools in manufacturing or piloting the planes, those careers are much less of a realistic choice. Or if there's just nowhere safe and private to go to the toilet and get changed on a construction work site, those high-paying roles are not a choice. Those situations are still all too common. Employers have a choice. Employers can create genuine opportunities for women and men to access the full range of roles and careers. Employers who make this choice are seeing the benefits. They're seeing happier and more productive workforce, and the data from our Australian employers has proven it's also good for the bottom line. Employers can choose not to take action on gender equality, but they risk being highlighted for their gender pay gap and missing out on contracting opportunities. But most importantly, they risk failing to attract the best people, the best talent. I've spent a lot of time today talking about employers and employees, but they're not two distinct groups. Employers are made up of employees. We're all people who go to work, go home, to a household, to a community. Experiences at work are not separate to our experience at home or in our neighbourhood. In fact, they're vitally linked. When a child sees their dad working flexibly so that they can do school pickup, or a mum going to work in a high-vis vest, or a woman fixing your plumbing, or a man tending to a loved one in a nursing home, this breaks down traditional gender norms, and the workplace is the catalyst. That's why WGEA's mandate is so vital, and why we're working so urgently to achieve it. To my many correspondents, including Nicola and Tom, who I detailed at the beginning, who want a genuine choice in their careers, I can assure you that the business case is clear. The sentiment is shifting, and employers are moving from building their knowledge to taking action to enable it to occur. To employers, you're not being asked to do this alone. The Australian Government's new gender equality strategy articulates a range of actions government is taking to drive improvements in gender equality broadly and in relation to the workplace. And WGEA is here to work alongside you to help you understand the opportunities and to build your capability to drive and achieve positive change. It's time to lift our sights, to be proud of our progress, but to commit to accelerate change so that together we can all ensure that people are fairly represented and equally valued and equally rewarded in the workplace. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. The idea of choice is used to explain, women choosing to stay home and raise kids, to go into part-time work, to enter feminised professions. But Diane Gander-Smith has described it as a false choice. I'm just wondering if you could kind of talk us through the difference between choice and false choice in those circumstances.
Thanks, Julie. And that's part of what I tried to get to in my address as well, is that I'm often told that I'm not pro-choice, hence that, everyone needs to be the same. And that is so far from the truth, is that choices are constrained, they're limited, and therefore people are not, and particularly women, but also men, are not being able to exercise those choices fully. Whether it be returning to work, the availability and affordability of childcare, for example, the access to meaningful part-time roles, the opportunities for men to genuinely engage and take paid parental leave and be able to combine a fulfilling career and the fulfilling responsibilities about engaging with family. So choices are very limited currently, and the capacity to create workplaces that support that full range of choices and the enabling environment around it is so fundamental so that people can exercise the choice in an unconstrained way.
Okay, thank you. First question, Rachel Clun.
Thanks so much, Mary. When the data first came out, a lot of companies were saying things like, well, we do pay men and women the same for the same job. There just happens to be a lot of women in those lower paid jobs. I'm just wondering, what's your sense of how those companies may have started to change their tune in the 4 weeks since you've released that data?
So thanks, Rachel. And we are getting a lot of engagement. I've got to say the response to our educational resources, we had, I think, nearly 1,000 downloads of our gender pay gap analysis tool, which we say is the first step. You've got to understand what's behind it, what's driving it, how before you can then have the evidence base to make change. Our engagement in our how do you do action planning, how do you actually think about addressing it, has been exceptionally positive. I think the journey we've got to go on is by the time we get to publishing next year, employers, the conversation needs to shift, and it has shifted from equal pay to, we've got a lot of men in senior roles, and that being a fait accompli is, okay, what have we done about it? How are we seeking to address it? How do we understand what's driving the problem, and what are we doing to make progress in it? This doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it is pipelines that take multiple years for that to occur, but we are seeing an openness and a willingness to engage on that discussion, both at an individual employer level and at an industry level, and momentum that we want to build on. And I'm hoping that the media in the room as well as us, next year we can say the conversations, well, you said that last year. Okay, what have you done about it? And the progression that we'll see on that journey will help to reinforce that that's an expectation, it's a need. And the last thing I'd touch on is employees. I think we are helping to empower employees to be also a catalyst and an agitator for action. Now, the responsibility sits with the employers, not the employees, but they can be an important catalyst for change and be an important solution and contributor to what needs to change in the future too.
Next question, Dan Holmes from the Mandarin.
Hi there. It was pointed out to me earlier that I'm one of a very small number of male journos in the audience today, so I thought I might ask something that goes to that a little bit. I've had the fortune of working at a lot of different places with a lot of great women in my life, and as a lot of people have, I've seen the way that they've been potentially abused or taken advantage of by managers in a variety of ways. So I was glad to hear you talk about the gender pay gap as sort of part of a set of cultural assumptions, maybe, than as a standalone issue. I guess I have concerns as a man in the workplace about how I approach those issues. How do I talk to my female colleagues and encourage them to stand up for themselves without just being another man in their ear telling them what to do?
Thanks, Dan. And look, this is really important. And I think, the shift of WGEA 10 years ago to being about equal opportunity for women to being about gender equality put a very clear line in the sand that this is about men and women, and that everyone needs to engage on the issue, and that everyone can benefit from more gender equal workplaces. So I would certainly encourage you individually and anyone thinking about that to not only get a bit informed in relation to what's going on, but to engage in those discussions, be open and honest and genuine in terms of both listening and contributing perspectives, and that we do need to engage in those discussions so that we can progress and make the change. Now, I think it's also interesting, for example, the Male Champions of Change, as it was originally established, was actually a very clear mark in the sand from Liz Broderick saying men need to lead on this too. Now, of course, that organisation's evolved, but to both men and women, and interestingly, part of that change has been that those CEOs who are largely all men, some of which have been replaced by women. But we've got very clear examples that this is workplace issues in terms of equality, in terms of safety, in terms of pay and recruitment and remuneration and promotion has to involve everyone. And especially at the moment when we have those more balanced towards men senior executive positions, men need to be an integral part of the solution of that change.
Thank you very much.
Jess Gardner, Australian Financial Review.
Thank you for your speech, and thank you for your acknowledging of the storytelling in our story on technology gender pay gaps. That was a fun one to craft. I'm interested in the next steps in the gender equality strategy that you outlined. Large companies are going to have to hit targets if they want to continue to be in the running for government work. Can you tell us how many companies that might affect, and whether you'll accept targets that they already have in place? Say if a firm has paid parental leave, is that sufficient meeting of that target, or will they have to show positive action extending paid parental leave or extending it to men and women, something like that?
Thanks, Jess, for that question. So twofold. One, we expect it to affect about 1,500 employers, and the numbers, will move a little bit. The threshold will be 500 or more employees, but it is a smaller subset of the overall reporting group. But also, it's the group that most significantly covers the most significant number of employees. So it's about 25% of the employers who report to us, but they cover close to 80% of all the employees in the data set. How we're crafting it, and these are obviously it still will be finalised, but our expectation is that from a menu which has about 20 different options, employers have to progress. So it's not enough to say, we've done parental leave, tick. It's about new, improved and progression. So if your gender pay gap is 15%, you might choose to have a target to get it to 10 or some other level. If you don't have parental leave, you need to add it. If you've got parental leave, it might be there's a suite of enhancements that you then need to add. So it isn't about incremental change, it's actually about significant improvement and continuing the momentum. Some employers do have targets around their composition. I think about BHP, for example, who've set a very significant target in shifting their workforce, which was highly masculinised. We would acknowledge their starting point now, and continuation of improvement would be recognised as part of that process. But they need to cover different things too, so you can't have it all around composition, and therefore, that might be sort of ultimately one issue for the three. You need to choose three from different areas so that there's progress being made across the board.
Thank you. I might just jump in here if that's okay. You just said that change is it's not about incremental change but significant improvement. You know, when you're a politician better than most people what it feels like to get rolled by a man. And then we look at what recently happened in South Australia with Anne Ruston losing the top Senate spot. So my question is, does the Liberal Party have a problem with women? And should it introduce quotas?
Thanks, Julie. I did retire from Parliament and politics 4 years ago, and of course now in my position as a federal public sector employee, I won't engage too much on a political level, but the Liberal Party is actually, not that different from all employers. And we've got very clear messages to all employers that this is good. It's a good thing to do. It's not only a good thing socially, it's a good thing economically, and you can translate that in a political context however you'd like to take that sort of through. But it's the right thing to do, and it actually makes a difference. It connects with your customers, it connects with your employees, and it leads to better outcomes. So the messages are consistent, regardless of who they land with, is that, the time for change is now. The community no longer accepts an expectation that things aren't equal, or that we're not striving towards it.
Thank you. Emma Partis, Bloomberg.
Hi. So in your speech, you discussed the importance of men taking on, more caring responsibilities and unpaid household labour. So what cultural or policy shifts do you think will be most imperative in shifting the dial in kind of increasing this share of household labour for men?
Well, thanks once again for the question, and it's really important and fundamental. And what my message is very clearly, and our message is that this is a message, this is actually for all parents in terms of leave. And it's not just for men, although it is reinforced for men because the numbers are so low. And from a WGEA perspective of our reporting employers, of all paid primary carers leave taken, only 14% is taken by men. So we've got a big gap. But that's up from about 7% a couple of years ago. So it's increasing off a low base, and there's momentum there, and we want to change. But we have to remove that penalty. And, men and women know that in many workplaces there is a penalty for taking that time out. There's a question about your commitment to your work. There's a question about your capacity to juggle those competing responsibilities. And there's, impediments while you're on leave in terms of things like pay rises and progression consideration. And that transition back to workplace, often there's an expectation that's going to be exactly the same as it was before, but it's not, because the world's fundamentally changed. So it requires, and this is where the targets is interesting, put in a paid parental leave, tick, but that's not going to solve the problem. It needs to translate into terms of how that's supported, encouraged, delivered, and what environment you come back into as a result. And let me just give you one example. I was talking with a senior executive the other day, and they're saying what they're moving to is a presumption that men and women, that parents will take parental leave, rather than a presumption that women will and men won't. And that fundamentally shifts the dynamic when you actually have to have a conversation to say why I'm not going to take leave versus then why I am. And that's some of the culture shift. And, these are early days, but these are some of the culture shifts that can actually make sure that it is a gender equal experience in terms of taking leave, providing care, and balancing those important responsibilities between work and family.
Thank you.
Ginger Gorman, Broad Agenda.
Thank you for your address, Mary, and thank you also for the work that you do at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. It was amazing watching the publication of the data recently, the employer pay gap data. It felt like your agency just threw a Molotov cocktail right into the middle of the issue. I wonder, if you look at the UK example, what would you expect the impact to be here in Australia, say, a decade from now, because of the publication of that data?
And thanks very much, Ginger, for the conversation. And I was very fortunate, actually, to just last week be at the Commission for the Status of Women and sat down with the woman who's heading the UK gender pay gap publishing experience. And she said they've loved seeing what we're doing, because we're evolving a bit what they're doing, and we're learning from each other in the journey. Where the evidence is showing, and they're 6 years in, but they've also had a pandemic, and they removed the reporting requirement during the pandemic. So it's, it's early days, but still some things we can draw on. Is that the gender pay gap has come down, but not just as a one-off, but it's been sustained over time, and that will certainly be one of our objectives, is to keep the conversation and evolve the conversation over the time to come. That particularly companies who had gender pay gaps higher than their peers were motivated to change. And, that's good. And as the higher numbers come down, the median and the averages will drop, and so more people will continue to be motivated. But we want to make sure, of course, that everyone is motivated to change, because there's opportunities across the board. There's been, some of the things I've talked about today, the fact that some of the investor groups have put the gender pay gap in their ESG indices, and that employees are using it as a mechanism for decision making. In fact, there's some recent research that shows that a proportion of women are prepared to take a lower salary to work for an employer that has a lower gender pay gap, because they see that environment they're going into is ultimately going to have more opportunities for them in the future. So these are real and genuine impacts in terms of the motivation for change. And so, we will be seeking to enhance all of them. A couple of things we've innovated on is things like providing the WGEA reports to the boards. We think will elevate the board discussion. In the UK, there was 70% more boards were having discussions around gender equality than had done before. We're now arming them with more information to do that as well, so we hope that'll be a further catalyst for change. But the broad objective is to reduce the gender pay gap, but what sits underneath that is that myriad of initiatives that each individual employer needs to take, reflective of their own circumstances, to achieve that outcome.
Thank you. Just got another question. That the Australian economy is structured differently from most other economies, in that a large majority of our employers are small and medium-sized enterprises. A lot of them don't have HR departments, and they don't have HR executives. They're just mums and dads running a business, and they would see a lot of this kind of idea and any reporting requirements on them as just added red tape and a burden. How do we get the message through to a sector that's struggling just to keep their head above, well, not a sector, I think I'm making broad assumptions there, but to a large part of the economy that, is small and under-resourced?
And I hear from a lot of employers who are fewer than 100 employees who don't report to us about their engagement in this issue as well. So there's no shortage of recognition right throughout our business community of the importance of gender equality. But the 2021 review of the Workplace Gender Equality Act looked specifically about whether the reporting requirements to WGEA should drop to 50 employees, which is seen as international best practice or not. But the decision was that, or the recommendation, which has been accepted, is that certainly coming off the back of COVID and the increase reporting requirements, that burden was a burden that we shouldn't add at this point in time. But if there were ways we could use technology to reduce the burden and do some linkages, for example, and between HR systems and WGEA reporting, many of those smaller companies don't even have HR systems, is part of the constraint. But could we use technology as a way to connect smaller employers into the WGEA reporting experience or not? And that's work that's ongoing, that is happening through government. But providing resources, providing support, providing the advocacy and increasing the knowledge of smaller employers about how they can take action in the absence of reporting is very much part of the remit and agenda to enhance everyone's knowledge on capacity about how they can have an impact in their workplace.
Okay, Georgie Dent, the Parenthood. Oh, where's she gone?
Thank you so much, Mary, for your speech and for your leadership in this area. I am interested to know, to what extent do you think that the efforts of employers and the choices of individual employees are constrained by public policy settings that continue to entrench the inequitable division of caring work and maintain our stubborn attachment to mums as caregivers and dads as breadwinners. Specifically, what impact do you think totally affordable, high-quality early education and an adequate and equitable federally funded paid parental leave policy would have on efforts to accelerate gender equality in workplaces?
Thanks, Georgie, and for your amazing advocacy on these issues as well. Now, once again, as a federal public servant, I won't comment specifically on government policy, but I've been very clear. Access to affordable and available childcare that can help and facilitate the choices that families and particularly women make in terms of being able to work. And they're really important aspects. Making sure parental leave encourages both men and women to take it, but in the context of employers need to, that's a starting point, not a finishing point in terms of that then being an effective policy, is absolutely crucial. And I think, we've seen from a public policy perspective, the government announce a number of initiatives that are moving us well down the track in terms of improving, recognising the importance of care, recognising that importance of paid parental leave, and, I'm sure those debates and policy discussions will continue.
Thank you. I'm sure they will too.
Rachel Clun.
Just to follow up on Georgie's question, there is a bit of debate at the moment about scrapping the activity test and how that's a real barrier for a lot of women to getting into work or getting the kind of hours they want. Do you think those sorts of reforms could be really helpful to boosting women's workforce participation?
So, Rachel, and I really enjoyed your article on this yesterday, I think it was, or recently, and obviously it's an important part of the debate. The Women's Economic Equality Task Force made some very clear recommendations in relation to what needed to happen to facilitate more women to be able to access care and to be able to then engage in looking for work or education or return to work. And I think, what I would do is point back to them in terms of the work that, led by Sam Mostyn, as really important advice to government. And from all reports, government is taking those recommendations incredibly seriously as the advice on how they move this agenda forward.
Kate Jenkins is going to ask a question instead of having to answer them.
I like being on this side, Mary. Mary, you started and you talked about collaboration in the sector and the complexity, and I know the Respect at Work Council that we were both on was an effort to bring together all the different regulators, safety and WGEA and the Human Rights Commission and employers to come together to remove that complexity. I was, as you know, really pleased in 2022 when they passed the positive duty, which included some reforms to the WGEA, which was the positive duty for employers to prevent sexual harassment. But my passion is bringing it to life. The laws are one thing, agencies are another. So I'm just wondering, from your position, given your face into employers, in particular on sexual harassment, what are you seeing in workplaces? Is there change? Is it fast enough? Is there enough panic? Is there enough passion about that? Is there change?
Thanks very much, Kate. And as I say, just your incredible work over such an extended period of time that still continues. Employers are taking it incredibly seriously. And I think there's a nervousness and an anxiousness about it, and a really seeking to understand what it practically means and how things have to change. So I think the translation of the impact of the change in the law to the experience on the ground is not going to be immediate, as we know. Well, there will be some things, but there's quite a journey for employers to go on in relation to it. But all the feedback that we get through the work that we've been doing is that it is shifting the dial, and that the conversation is actually assisting this broader conversation that we all have, where we all come back to is about equality, and about equality for men and women. So you can't talk about respect and sexual harassment in a workplace unless you're also having a fundamental conversation about equality in the workplace. And that's why it reinforces all the work that happens in lots of different ways, but with the ultimate goal in this context to ensure that workplaces are safe, but also from our context is to progress the broader gender equality as well. One of the things that we've done as a result of Respect at Work is add a much more comprehensive set of questions to employers about what they're doing, what are their policies, what are their practices, what are they putting in place to prevent discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace. And in fact, the lovely linkage between the two is that the feedback we're getting from employers is those questions are actually fundamentally underpinning in addition to our broader questions, evidence about that employers are acting proactively to make sure their workplaces are safe. So I think your recommendations are mutually reinforcing to achieve that broader objective of not just safe workplaces, but also equal workplaces.
Thank you, Marion. Great speech.
Thank you. And the last question is from me. So Katie Gallagher, in her speech here a couple of weeks ago, spoke about using the government's procurement power to promote female-led and female-owned businesses. Just how revolutionary is this idea, and how do you think it could fundamentally build up the power of female businesses?
Thanks, Julie. And particularly, the Workplace Gender Equality Act has always had a requirement. The government's gender equality procurement principles, which are noted in the Act, have always had a requirement that you have to be compliant with WGEA in order to procure from government. And so the linkage between introducing targets and upping the ante in terms of the requirements for employers to not only report, but now take action and make progress against that, I think is a fundamental shift in terms of equality. And what it will do is make sure that women in workplaces across the board do have a more gender equal experience. So I do think that it is bold and innovative and will be a catalyst for important change to achieve the outcomes that we're seeking. And some of them will be businesses led by women and owned by women, and all of them will be about women at the most senior levels and all throughout organisations in terms of having that gender equal experience.
Please join me in thanking Mary Wooldridge.